Now, as you probably know, in recent work, I have been insisting that the fantasy of repair has overwhelming influence in the life of NI dominance. Of course, INTJs and INFJs will tend to go about it in different ways. The fantasy of repair expresses itself via people, more so in the case of INFJs, things, objects, and facts, more so in the case of INTJs. And of course, within the INTJ population, there's also diversity and ramifications, and the same applies to the population of INFJs. Nevertheless, this idea of the fantasy of repair, and always remember that we're talking about fantasy PH for a deep-seated, formed early in childhood, unconscious fantasy that structures experience. It almost has the influence of what Jung would call an archetype. In some sense, the fundamental fantasy PH, if we call it repair in the case of NI dominance, this is kind of in Jungian speak, tantamount to talking about the fundamental archetype, the most influential archetype. Except that in the case of fantasy, these are not the same depending on the kind of family you're in. That is to say, the kind of type you belong to. In the case of NI dominance, fantasy of repair seems to be the most influential one, the fundamental one. At least this is really what I believe, what I conjecture, what I hypothesize, and certainly will be a great cross-cutting theme of my upcoming NI book. I started working on that book. It will take a while to write and then to format, edit, proofread, and so on, and publish, but the work has already started. So this fantasy of repair, fantasy PH, again, a useful way to distinguish it from fantasy with an F is that fantasy with an F is like a recurring theme in your, that you can consciously identify from the observation of your daydreams, of your reveries, of your, of what people call in ordinary speech their fantasies. There's a level of consciousness of these, and that's fantasy with an F. Fantasy with PH is deeper. It's deeper. It's something that is formed early in life and really has this way of structuring the whole of experience in a sense. And this is an argument that I make already in the notes that I'm compiling or writing down in preparation for the NI book. The most fundamental of our fantasies with PH sort of holds our world together, it's kind of a Brahmian knot, the kernel of the unconscious that keeps this whole mess together. And so we don't want to mess with it too much. We don't want to break it, certainly. We don't want to tear it apart. Hence the fact that when I talk about the fantasy of repair in the case of NI dominance, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about something that ought to be dissolved, something that ought to be overcome, something that ought to be cancelled. By no means, no. Oh God, no. I think it's important to get a better grasp of this fantasy, of how one relates, the stance that one takes in relation to this fantasy, because a great deal hinges on the stance that one takes in relation to fundamental fantasy. Some NI dominants will have a stance toward it, this repair fantasy, that leads them towards hypervigilance rather than hyper-awareness. Hypervigilance is born out of anxiety and fear in many ways, whereas hyper-awareness obviously emerges out of the opposite side of the spectrum, namely inner calm and peace of mind. So we can take the hypervigilance of some NI dominants and contrast them to the calmer awareness of other NI dominants as two modes of expression of how they relate to their fundamental fantasy. And that's kind of similar to saying how they relate to the way in which they mediate between their inner world and the outer world. How do they mediate the encounter between the inner ocean and the outer concrete block? Do they conflict? Do they clash? Or are there ways of having them connect? Okay. But those who are adept at seeking interstices and knowing how to remain within their NI speech in a way that does not actually preclude or obstruct their adaptation to reality, do not, by that token, abandon their repair fantasy. You see, a fantasy, like I said, is absolutely essential. We all have fantasies, and at least I belong to the school that believes that there is a fundamental fantasy, and that the fundamental fantasy can be articulated in slightly different words depending on the kind of person you are, but there will be very similar themes depending on the type family you belong to. And in the case of anti-dominance, the repair fantasy seems to be the overarching theme. If you choose to be a healer of society, that is very different from someone who suffers from a nurse syndrome. Someone who chooses to be a healer of society may very well thrive, blossom, and you can be a healer in a lot of different ways, of course. It can be metaphorical or it can be quite literal, but in both cases, there's something very gratifying in it, something very nourishing in it, and even something socially valued in it. Very different from a mode of expressing the repair fantasy that probably has its worst possible expression, its most pathological expression, in the Munchausen syndrome by proxy. For those who are familiar with that notorious disorder. But all the various manifestations of what we typically call the nurse syndrome are manifestations of a repair fantasy where the subject has not really become the center of its world. And certainly I will explore more about this in my future book, but hopefully if I can make that clear enough for myself first and then for you in future video content as well. So that's all for my observations and my clarifications around the repair fantasy. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video, guys. Don't forget about my 2 books on the INFJ that you can both get. They look good together, don't they? The Infinite Soul and the Outer World of the INFJ, and the Ecstatic Soul and the Inner World go very well together. Get both books at the links below in the description box if you haven't yet. If you want a deep understanding of this type, you need to read them. And also don't forget my Patreon, guys. I could not do this without you. I need you more than ever. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. For a few bucks a month, you get access to bonus content, video content. There's now a fairly large library that's been, enriched every 2-3 weeks with deep dives into certain topics, mostly of your own choosing, the choosing of the patron members. And also you get access to our Discord server where you can interact with me and other members of our lovely community on a day-to-day basis, and that's really nice. So consider it, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.